Tomorrow for sure. 24 hours later. 24 hours later. Early
32 hours later.
Early the next morning.
Stupid early the next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. Next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning, like every morning.
The next day. The next day.
The next day.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day.
The next day.
The next day in a parallel universe. The very next day.
The following day. Tomorrow.
The very next evening. The next evening. The next Christmas. The next level. Days later. One day later. One full day of fatherly fun later.
Day 2. 48 hours later. 2 days later. Day 3. 72 hours. Three days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 6 messy days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several days later. Several days later. Several long days later. Many disorderly days later.
1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later.
1 week later.
1 week later.
1 smelly week later. 1 soggy week later. 1 weekend later. 1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. 2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later.
6 to 8 weeks later. Several weeks later.
Six months later. 6 months later.
6 months later!
7 months later.
Several months later. Many months later.
Well-
Many.
Months later!
12 years later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
2,000-ish years later.
3,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
5 million years later.
One entree later. An eternity later. An eternity later. An eternity later. One eternity later.
One eternity later.
Opening night.
A couple of hours later.
A lot of boring math later.
A lot of wallpapers later.
Very boring walk later.
Many frame building attempts later. Many heartfelt traditions later. Many attempts to fix the past later. Many amusements later.
Many buckets later.
Many invitations later. Many meeps later. Many meeps later. Many memories later. Many miles later. Many exam questions later.
Many amusements later.
Many repressed memories later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later.
Many tic-tacs later. Many secret parties later.
Many versions later.
Many wishes later.
Many painful holes later. Many forks later. Much tranquility later. One humongous meal later.
One semester later. One season later. 8 semesters later. One debt to society later.
One journey through space later.
One very long digestive tract later.
One load screen later.
One loading screen later. One loading screen later.
One little boost to the self.
One pathetic sob story later.
One meme retrospective later.
One bus ride later.
One frozen wasteland later. One long angry line later.
One beautiful Christmas morning later. One movie later.
One shift later. One shift later. One extremely annoying shift later. One winner later. One nap later.
One nap later.
One operation later. One pair of pants later.
One pair of pants later.
One scary rod later.
One trip to the emergency room later. One million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later.
2 idiots later.
3 annoying songs later.
82 kilometers later. 237 hours later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later.
800 kajillion potatoes later.
Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later. Several thousand ripped pants later.
Some time later.
Even more boat building attempts later. Graduation day.
What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone?
First lesson, shape-shifting. Next lesson, staring. Haunting houses. Last lesson,
Epilogue. Epilogue.
Game over!
I don't believe in magic! I don't believe in magic! I don't believe in magic! Oh
The end.
Let me at him, Pop! Let me at him! Let me at him! Let me...
I don't get it.
The end.
This is a family show.
The end is so itchy.
Many, blowing up the whole earth for shame.
Prison!
Yes, hello? I'll take your heaviest object.
Try jiggling the antenna. Oh, I can see my house from here!
Time! Everybody say Merry Christmas!
Merry Christmas! Today's show went in all sorts of different directions. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Oh, it sure is good to be back. Hey, PA! I'll have the usual.
Bud espresso coming right up.
And so ends another exciting episode of The Patrick Star Show. The end. Not responsible for shattered teeth.
Ice King! We miss you so! Why, Neptune? Why?
We had overdue books too. Going on.
Going on!
Worked out in the end.
You know, Patrick, there's still time to do a show today.
Only if I could work with my favorite director and sister.
Don't make me sick.
The end is correct! We have a winner!
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.